Welcome to ILTV Security Brief. I'm Khaled Ben David. Each week we focus on the latest developments in security and defense relating to Israel and the Middle East, impacting on this region and beyond. And we start with our top items of the past week. 2 Israeli soldiers are killed and 3 wounded as terrorists attack an IDF outpost in Rafah in violation of the Gaza truce agreement. After responding with airstrikes and artillery fire on Hamas targets throughout Gaza, the IDF returns to observing the ceasefire, laying down yellow markers along its new withdrawal lines. The bodies of Tamir Adar and Ari Zalmanovich, both murdered at Kibbutz Nir Oz during the October 7th attack, are returned by Hamas under the ceasefire deal, leaving the remains of 13 other hostages still in Gaza. Israel accuses the terror group of deliberately delaying the return of the bodies that it has access to in violation of the agreement. Visiting the new U.S. Command Center in Israel for monitoring the ceasefire, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance says that despite some violations, the Gaza agreement is going better than expected, and he urged Israel to show patience as the deal is being implemented. The Israeli cabinet approves changing the official name of the October 7th war from Operation Swords of Iron to the War of Redemption. And Prime Minister Netanyahu dismisses Likud politician Tzachi Hanegbi as his national security advisor after the two reportedly clashed over the PM's decision to strike Hamas leaders in Gaza. And now our big story. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance came to Israel this week with a message for Jerusalem. You have every right to defend yourself if Hamas or other terror groups attack your troops in Gaza, but don't take actions that impede or endanger the overall ceasefire plan. Now, this means approving IDF counterstrikes on Hamas positions, but not delaying humanitarian aid shipments or the opening of the Rafah crossing. Vance said the Gaza process will have hills and valleys, but it should move forward nonetheless. Now, that may be a tough pill for Prime Minister Netanyahu to swallow as arrangements advance for Phase 2 of the Gaza plan, including the creation of an Arab-Muslim international security force under U.S. supervision that is supposed to secure those areas of Gaza that the IDF has withdrawn from. And Hamas is already retrenching in. But who will be in that force and what are its parameters are just one of several issues the U.S. and Israel still have to iron out. Here's what Vance had to say at the new U.S.-led Civilian Military Coordination Center in Kiryat Gat.
What troops are on the ground in Israel is going to be a question the Israelis have to agree to, and I'm sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu will have opinions about that, but we think everybody has a role to play here. Some of that's going to be financial, some of that's going to be in reconstruction, some of that's just in communication with the various parties to ensure that this deconfliction process actually works and is implemented. We're not going to force anything on our Israeli friends when it comes to foreign troops on their soil, but we do think that there's a constructive role for the Turks to play, and frankly, they've already played a very constructive role. We're very grateful for that.
And joining us now for more is Dan Feferman. He is a Middle East analyst and former intelligence officer. He's co-editor of the Middle East 24 news platform, and he's the chairman of Sharaka, a nonprofit group that promotes Abraham Accords diplomacy. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's look at this Gaza ceasefire, how it's going, and the U.S. perception of it as opposed to perhaps the Israeli perception. Vice President Vance, you'd expect him to try to put out an optimistic picture of it. He says it's going better than expected. There's going to be hills and valleys. We're in the hills. I'm not sure. I think in Israel, the perception of it is somewhat different. And the question is how much patience Israel is going to have going forward.
Yeah, I mean, Vice President Vance is here. Secretary of State Rubio is on his way. You know, I've heard it thrown around the media that they're here to babysit, right? To make sure that the Israeli government is not kind of pushed off course, as you hear, you know, people who are looking more at the valleys as opposed to the hills of this, or whichever one is the positive and the negative. But it should be clear from the start that this is actually the ceasefire agreement, this peace plan that was hailed by Trump himself here in Jerusalem, by the administration. Hamas did not agree to it, right? And so we should be really looking at it in two parts. The first one is not quite yet implemented, and that's where we are right now. And even here you see Hamas popping out of the tunnels near the Rafah area, killing two of our soldiers. The next step is going to be dependent on that multinational force. And here you have to have American leadership, you have to have American momentum, you have to have positivity, and that's the tone of Vance's speech, that's the tone of their message, because the key here for the United States is not necessarily to be involved on the ground fighting. There, it's actually best that you have Muslim and or Arab troops and soldiers doing that because you maintain the legitimacy. The key here is to have American leadership, the glue, the carrots and sticks behind the scenes, and that's why you hear this message of positivity, which is all about momentum to keep this train going.
Now, about this multinational Arab and Muslim force, perhaps more accurately, as you heard, Vice President Vance saying the U.S. will not force Israel to accept any country to be a part of it that does not see as appropriate. However, two names that have come up, Turkey and Qatar. It's clear Vice President Vance sees certainly those countries as having some role in Gaza, in a post-Hamas Gaza, which is problematic for Israel, given the history of Israel has had with those two countries. Is there an area in which this could be worked out between the U.S. and Israel?
Yeah, I mean, Turkey and Qatar are the two prime political backers. In Qatar's case, it's also one of the financial backers of Hamas. And it's clear that Hamas would not have been pressured to pretend to accept this deal without pressure from the Turks and the Qataris, and you needed a lot of American pressure, again, the stick and carrot approach on both of them to get Hamas to at least agree to the first phase of this deal. They haven't agreed to the second part. The Qataris aren't going to send troops. That's not what they do. It is possible the Turks could be on the ground, and as long as there is consistent American pressure and expectations, I don't see it so much as necessarily a negative thing. What you do want to avoid is a scenario in which maybe rogue Turkish soldiers, maybe a scenario in which there's some kind of clash or tension between the Turks and IDF fighters on the other side of the, whatever the ceasefire, the withdrawal line here. But we've also, there's been talks of possibly Pakistani soldiers, which certainly Israel does not have any relations, but the tone is not a positive one. There's talks about Indonesian soldiers, and then possibly, of course, Egyptian soldiers, and maybe some kind of Emirati or Saudi presence in that international force.
Right. You mentioned some countries that Israel doesn't have relations with taking part in that security force, which also does raise the question of how much the creation of not only that force, but just the overall Gaza ceasefire plan could lead to an expansion of the Abraham Accords. That's something that Israel certainly wants to see develop without it. You've been very active in, as we mentioned, in promoting diplomacy of the Abraham Accords. How realistic is that if we just at least take the assumption that the process is going to proceed as planned in the near future?
The promise that we have here, the potential that we have here, I think you said it well. It's the potential expansion of the Abraham Accords and using the countries that want to join or are already part of the Accords to be part of this multinational force to get Israel out of Gaza, to reduce the tensions, and to work on some kind of mechanism to disarm Hamas. That's, of course, much easier said than done. At the end of the day, it's been clear, I think, from the very beginning, that the only people, the only forces, the only countries that can disarm Hamas, and then the next step, of course, is going to be de-radicalizing Gaza and de-radicalizing Palestinian society, overseeing a transformation of the Palestinian Authority, has to be the Arab world. It has to be the Muslim world. Israel can't do it. The U.S. Can't do it and doesn't have the domestic legitimacy, the political will to do this. It's going to have to be a coalition of the Abraham Accords and then the potential Abraham Accords. The questions are, will we see an expansion of the Accords and then those countries joining in order to build trust with Israel? That's a possibility. Or will they join this multinational force in order to prepare their own publics in the region on the public narrative side and then join the Accord? So, I mean, that's one of the questions we'll be asking as we go forward in the coming months. The big question, though, however, is there the political will, and will there be the continued American leadership to ensure the disarmament of Hamas? Everything rides on that.
Right. I want to go back to your point about de-radicalizing Gaza, because that is so important, certainly moving forward, seeing this thing is going to last just beyond the initial steps. A big part of that, of course, the radicalization of Gazan youth, of Palestinian youth there, has been through compromised aid organizations affiliated with the United Nations and elsewhere. How much is that going to be so important? Because that is not an issue that we're looking at down the road. the question of aid distribution and making sure it's distributed rightly and avoiding a situation of going to de-radicalization is really something that has to be addressed now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the key things that has led to continued conflict, not just among Hamas and in Gaza, but also in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, has been the consistent decades-long radicalization of Palestinian society that refuses to recognize Israel's existence, certainly Israel's rights to be here, and the chance of peace. And using the vehicle of Islamism, of radical Islam, to do that in many cases, using the imagery of Al-Aqsa, as we've seen over and over again. Even the October 7th attack was called the Al-Aqsa flood. What you have are very good examples in parts of the Arab and Muslim world. We're talking about the Emiratis. We're talking about the Saudis who are doing it now. We're even talking about countries like Indonesia, again, who might partake in this and who might join the Abraham Accords, who have very good track records and experiences with de-radicalization. The Moroccans on the other side have models of this. And so that's really going to be critical in the post-disarming of Hamas phase to get to the next phase. Otherwise, you're just going to have another generation and another generation of Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, who want to attack Israel, who want to perpetuate this war, who refuse to cede that this conflict can and should be over.
Dan, you travel quite abroad quite a bit for your work with Sharaka and others. I want to just look at this situation.
Too much if my wife has anything to say.
But you're also dealing with a lot of countering some of the anti-Israel sentiment that's been abroad, that's an anti-Semitic, certainly we have to say, that certainly has accelerated and generated in the past 2 years. How do you see that moving forward, whether that will continue like that, potentially get worse or less, and how it should be countered now?
You know, what we understood after October 7th is that the anti-Semitism, in the guise of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, has been there, it's been brewing, and it's been pushed and built and funded both on the far left, from the Islamist side, from backers like Qatar, from also Iran, but also now we're seeing it emerge on the right. The war was an excuse, was a fuel, was a catalyst for this. It's going to maybe calm down a little bit. But, you know, I live on the internet, I live in that, I speak around the world regularly, and it's still there, it's still very strong. We're going to need a lot of coalition building. And ironically, where you see the strong anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment, anti-democracy sentiment, anti-capitalism sentiment is coming from the West and people embedded in the West, you don't hear the same discourse, or you see the discourse dying down actually in the more functioning countries of the Middle East and of the Muslim world right now, being guided by their governments, of course. And so you see a very interesting trend. We need to build strong regional civilizational alliances. This is not just about Israel or the Jews. This is about the future of the West. This is about the future of democracies and capitalism. And the enemies of that are seeking to utilize this war, whatever the next war will be, whatever the next crisis will be, to wear down at the foundations of Western civilization.
Right. And Dan, stay with us, because one of the countries you just mentioned is one of the enemies, certainly, of the push towards peace and coexistence here, is the nation of Iran. And in a further escalation of the crisis over Iran's nuclear ambitions, the regime has announced that it has scrapped its cooperation agreement with the UN nuclear watchdog. That ends inspections that had resumed just weeks ago. Now, Iranian officials say they will only return to talks if Washington guarantees no more strikes. Nuclear negotiations have been frozen since the June war between Israel and Iran. That's raising concerns that Tehran could now rebuild its enrichment program in secret. The Supreme Leader Khamenei has rejected Trump's offer to resume nuclear talks, calling U.S. interventions arrogant. Trump had told the Knesset just last week that the June airstrikes destroyed Iran's nuclear capability. However, U.S. intelligence estimates say the damage may have only delayed the program by a few months. And the Ayatollah Khamenei has mocked U.S. President Trump's claim that American airstrikes destroyed Iran's nuclear program, saying, quote, keep dreaming.
افتخار میکنه که صنعت هسته‌ای ایران رو بمباران کردیم و از بین بردیم. خب خیلی خوب، همین خیال باشه. اما اصلا شما چه کاره هستید که اگر یک کشوری صنعت هسته‌ای داره شما دخالت کنید بگید باید و نباید؟ شما چه کاره دنیایی؟ چه ربطی به آمریکا داره که ایران امکانات هسته‌ای و صنعت هسته‌ای داره یا نداره؟ این دخالت‌های ناواق، ناجور، غلط و زورگویانه است. من اهل معامله‌ام، میخوام معامله کنم، با ایران معامله کنیم. معامله ای که با زورگویی نتیجه او از پیش معلوم باشه معامله نیست، تحمیل به ملت ایران زیر بار تحمیل نخواهد رفت.
Dan, with all the focus now on Gaza, understandable, perhaps some attention has been lost to what it still remains Israel's major existential threat. And, of course, just the existence of that threat puts in danger, jeopardizes a lot of the processes, for example, regarding Gaza, regarding expanding the Abraham Accords throughout the region that we've just been talking about.
You know, one of the reasons we're able to talk about a ceasefire in Gaza, one of the reasons we're able to talk about the potential of Hezbollah being disarmed, of course, it's a tough process, of a new regime in Syria, is because Iran was so severely weakened and embarrassed as being weakened in the June strike by Israel and the United States. You know, I think it's fitting, maybe symbolic, to see this leader who can barely talk, who's really on his last legs, speaking of, you know, Iranian in such terms of bravado and U.S. arrogance. The Iranians have been instigating, have been infiltrating, have been spreading extremism throughout the entire region since, you know, the 1980s, since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And they're clearly weakened right now. There is no other way but to pressure them, to offer them off-ramps, but to not think that this regime under Khamenei can moderate in any kind of way. And so the U.S. intelligence assessment, I think, is flawed. That's one assessment. There are others. I believe the setback is actually in terms of years. Iran's airspace, even though they're trying to rebuild a deterrence capacity, they're trying to rebuild their air force, has been destroyed. It's going to take some time for Iran to be able to even defend itself again. And what is clear here is you need a combination of U.S., European, international pressure on Iran on the nuclear front. You need regional pressure. And you're hearing something very new around the region that we talk about all the time. When I speak to people around the region, is that the peoples of Syria, of Lebanon, of Iraq, of the Gulf countries are no longer afraid of Iran because Iran has been exposed as the paper tiger that it is. And so there is a real opportunity here if we see consistent American leadership, consistent American strong diplomacy, peace through strength, right, which I believe is one of the mantras of the Trump administration, and American leadership to get everyone on board. It is possible to make serious strides, both in pushing back, defeating, disarming radical groups, to keeping Iran at bay, and to keeping the pressure on Iran. Their economy is in the toilet right now. They really are not able to reconstruct in any meaningful way their nuclear program, their missile program, their air defenses. And I think it's just symbolic that Khamenei sounds the way he is, and maybe that's you know, a symbol of what the regime is at this point.
Well, let's hope so. Dan Feferman, thank you for joining us on ILTV.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And let's turn now to the northern front, where Israeli troops demolished several Hezbollah outposts on the Lebanese side of Mount Dov. The operation was carried out by the IDF's Mountain Brigade, which celebrated its first anniversary with another successful operation. More from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
In the nighttime operation, IDF troops from the Mountain Brigade operated beyond the border, demolishing several Hezbollah posts on the Lebanese side of Mount Dov. The operation was carried out by reservists and combat engineers of the 810th Mountains Regional Brigade. The IDF said that the posts were destroyed to prevent them from being used by Hezbollah to entrench itself in the area in the future. The move marks a continued effort by Israel to disrupt Hezbollah's infrastructure along the northern border amid rising tensions in the region. The IDF released new footage of the Mountain Brigade marking 1 year since its formation. The brigade is deployed along Israel's northern front, defending the strategic area from Lebanon's Mount Dov to Syria's Hermon summit. Over the past year, troops of the 810th Mountain Brigade carried out dozens of operations across both fronts. During Operation Northern Arrows, forces dismantled Hezbollah terror infrastructure in the Mount Dov region, uncovering underground tunnel routes and seizing large quantities of weapons. In Operation Bashan Arrows, conducted in the Syrian Hermon summit area, the brigade led the IDF's advance into the region and has maintained ongoing defensive and operational activity there ever since. The IDF said the Mountain Brigade continues to operate on both fronts, targeting terrorist infrastructure that threatens Israeli communities and working to ensure the security of civilians in the north.
And now a final word. In 1948, despite being the first country to grant official diplomatic recognition to Israel, the United States also initiated a ban on weapons sales to the besieged Jewish state in order to avoid any military involvement in the Middle East. Over the years, American attitudes towards Israel's security situation gradually changed, with the U.S. becoming its main arms supplier, providing over $20 billion in sales and aid during the Gaza war. The Israel-U.S. security relationship has developed in other ways, too, sharing defense technology and intelligence, the deployment of U.S. monitoring forces in the Sinai to ensure the Camp David Accords, and cooperation on certain covert actions against common enemies. The Trump administration can be said to have elevated this cooperation to an unprecedented new level with the U.S. airstrike on Iranian nuclear facilities in the midst of Israel's conflict with the Iran regime last June. But through all of this long history, one principle has remained in place. Whatever help Israel has received from the U.S., it remains responsible for its own security, backed by the unfettered might of the IDF and its other defense-related assets. But with the resolution of the current Gaza operation through the U.S.-mediated agreement with Hamas, the Israel-America security relationship is entering uncharted waters. For the first time, foreign forces are set to enter part of the territory conquered by Israel in the Six-Day War outside of the context of a formal peace treaty, and they're to be granted some of the responsibility for maintaining security there, including that ensuring that Hamas ceases all hostile actions and gives up all of its arms. Though the soldiers comprising this force will be drawn from a coalition of Arab and Muslim states, they will be directed by and held directly responsible to the U.S. via the new U.S.-led Civilian Military Coordination Center monitoring the ceasefire, and also the Board of Peace chaired by President Trump, charged with overseeing the reconstruction and governance of Gaza. Under this new arrangement, what guarantees does Israel have in confirming the decommissioning of Hamas's arms? How much authority does Israel have in deciding which Arab and Muslim nations will take part in securing Gaza? And most crucially, how much latitude will Israel have in deploying the IDF against imminent threats from Gaza if it perceives these other security arrangements are failing to do so? These are questions that need to be answered, and they need to be answered quickly. The events of the past week make clear that Hamas and other terror elements in Gaza have little intention in abiding by the letter of the agreement that brought this round of fighting to a close. Ultimately, it will require a show of force by someone to completely eliminate the threat they pose to Israel. The Trump administration has done enough to earn the trust of Israel to carry out the promises implicit in the Gaza agreement. But when President Trump was pressed by a reporter this weekend on how the ceasefire will be guaranteed by the U.S., he said that's, quote, in the hands of others, and he cited 59 other countries who signed off on the Gaza agreement. Elsewhere, Trump himself raised the possibility of a change in the priorities of his administration or of successive U.S. governments when it comes to Gaza and broader Mideast issues. All this means that Israel must press the U.S. to provide explicit public admissions of exactly what will be the depth of its commitment to rid Gaza of a militant Hamas and ensure its security thereafter, and what Israel will be permitted to do if those options prove inadequate. In the long history of its relationship, Israel has never asked the U.S. to guarantee its security or put American lives on the line in its defense. Its only request has been, as Winston Churchill once asked America in that country, in the UK struggle to defend democracy against the forces of darkness, will be to provide the tools needed to defend itself. But in asking Israel to stand down in Gaza with the fight against Hamas unfinished, The U.S. has taken upon itself new responsibilities for maintaining peace and security in the region, and Israel should not be shy in calling upon it to fulfill those pledges. Ultimately, though, the lesson of the past few weeks is an old one for Israel, namely that when it comes to defending its own security and interests, Israel must maintain the capability and the will to do so by itself when necessary. Thank you for joining us on ILTV Security Brief.